I was dead for 11 minutes. That sentence still doesn't feel real when I say it out loud. But it's in my medical chart. It's on the record. And it's the only honest way I know to begin what I'm about to tell you. My name is Marcus Hale. I'm 38 years old. I've spent the better part of my adult life writing about exactly the kind of people I was about to become. True believers, spiritual seekers, men and women who claimed they'd seen things on the other side of death and came back with a message from God. I wrote about them with precision. I wrote about them with wit. And I wrote about them with the particular cruelty of someone who thought cleverness was the same thing as wisdom. Before I tell you what happened in those 11 minutes, I need you to understand what kind of man I was before them. Because what Jesus showed me, what he showed me about a mark, about two groups of people, about what is already happening as we move toward 2026. It doesn't make sense without knowing who I was when I walked into that intersection. So let me go back. 3 years ago, a documentary started circulating online. You may have seen it, one of those low-budget productions with bad lighting and passionate narration. The kind that gets millions of views from people who share it without comment. Just a link and a raised eyebrow emoji. The subject was a pastor named Elias Rowe. He was 62, independent, unpolished, unaffiliated with any denomination, and he had a prophecy. The prophecy was this: a separation was coming, not a physical catastrophe, a spiritual threshold, a moment when the accumulated weight of each person's choices would settle into visible consequence. A mark, he called it. Not a chip, not a tattoo, not anything from Revelation. A condition of the heart, a spiritual state forming in each person, quietly, through years of small decisions. And by 2026, that condition would become fixed in a way it had never been before. I watched 20 minutes of that documentary before I started taking notes. My editor had been pushing me to write something about the prophetic content boom, end times anxiety monetizing through YouTube, the wellness to prophecy pipeline. Pastor Rowe dropped into my lap like a gift. I wrote the piece in one evening, sharp, exactly condescending enough to feel authoritative, with just enough grace extended to the frightened people in Rowe's audience so I could dissect their psychology without sounding cruel. 20,000 shares in 3 days. My editor called it the best thing I'd written that quarter. Sarah read it the night it went up. She was sitting at the kitchen table when I walked in, my phone in her hand, scrolling. She finished reading, set it down, and looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't name, and then she said, "Dinner's almost ready." That was all. She never said another word about it, and I took that silence for permission. I think about that now. My wife, who teaches second grade, who prays before bed without making a production of it, who never once pushed me toward her faith because she understood that pushing was the wrong instrument. She read what I'd written about a man who delivered a sincere warning, and she said nothing. I didn't ask her why. It was a Thursday in October. Ordinary. The kind that doesn't announce itself as the last ordinary day of your life. I'd been at a coffee meeting with a colleague, driving home, thinking about a new piece. I don't remember the intersection. I don't remember the impact. What I remember is the moment just before. A stillness that settled over everything with the completeness of a theater going dark. Not frightening. Just quiet. The way a room gets quiet when someone in it has realized something enormous and hasn't yet decided how to react. Then nothing. What the record shows. An SUV ran a red light and struck my car on the driver's side. Paramedic response time, 12 minutes. By the time the first unit arrived, I was unresponsive. Cardiac arrest in the ambulance. On the table, the attending worked the team for 7 minutes before a resident called the time of death. Then, something unexpected. The attending physician's notes described a spontaneous return of circulation with no clear precipitating intervention. The monitors changed. The flat line broke. 11 minutes. That's how long my heart was stopped. Here's what no medical chart recorded about those 11 minutes. There was no tunnel. I want to say that clearly. I spent years categorizing tunnel descriptions as an artifact of oxygen deprivation in the optic nerve. And I'm still enough of who I was to note when I was right about a detail and wrong about everything the detail was supposed to prove. There was no rushing darkness. What there was, and I still don't have language adequate for this, was an absence of the wrong kind of existence. As if the reality I'd been inhabiting was itself the diminished state, and what I was stepping into was simply what things actually were. I was aware of being outside my body before any other awareness arrived. And I mean I was aware of it the way you're aware that you're standing in a room, not as a revelation, not as a shock, just fact. I was. And I was somewhere that had no geometry I could name. Not dark, not bright, a quality I've since tried to describe as lit from inside. Not light arriving from somewhere, but light being the condition of the space itself, which, as a man who spent 15 years explaining how the universe worked, was the first thing I encountered that my entire framework had no grid for. My first instinct was to look for the seams. I'm telling you honestly, I could not find them. No dream logic to exploit, no internal inconsistency to triangulate back to a misfiring brain. Whatever I was in was coherent in a way that made my waking life feel thin. Then something began to approach, not from a direction. That's the part I keep coming back to when I try to explain it. Not from left or right, not from above or below, from everywhere simultaneously, the way temperature changes in a room. You can't point to where the warmth is coming from, but you know without question that it's there, and that it's increasing. I knew, before anything could be called an encounter, that whatever was approaching had already read everything I ever wrote. Not as a metaphor, as a fact. The way you know a person has walked into a room before you turn around. I noticed my wedding ring. I don't know how. I had no body to speak of, no hand to look down at, but I was aware of it. Aware of Sarah on the other side of whatever separated us. The awareness didn't feel like longing exactly. It felt like weight, like unfinished accounting. I know what Jesus looks like. 10,000 paintings, stained glass windows, first-hand accounts I'd catalogued and filed under neurological artifact. I went into that space with a composite image I'd built from all of it. What I encountered bore no resemblance to it. I didn't see him the way you see a person across a room. What I experienced was recognition. Total, instantaneous, not intellectual, not like placing a face from memory. Deeper. The way you might suddenly recognize that you are afraid, not that you are looking at something frightening. He was simply present. He did not introduce himself. There was no need. What I remember is not his appearance, but what it felt like to be seen by him. I have written for a living. I know how to perform, how to construct a persona, how to present the version of myself most advantageous to the moment. Every tool I'd ever developed for managing how I was perceived became instantly transparent. Not gone, transparent. As if someone had turned on a light and every piece of furniture you'd rearranged to look casual was suddenly visible in its actual position. He did not condemn me. That matters. I need you to understand that he did not come at me with judgment. What I felt was something closer to sorrow. Not his sorrow at me, but something more like the sorrow of a surgeon who has found the disease later than they would have chosen. A grief that is not punitive. A grief that is entirely concerned with what comes next. He asked me one question, not accusatory, genuinely curious. The precise cadence of someone who already knows the answer but wants to see if you do too. He asked me about the article. Not by title, not by describing it. He simply asked, why did I do what I did to that man who was only afraid and was only trying to warn people? And I had nothing. I've argued for a living. I've been the person in every room who could find the angle, the counterpoint, the reframe. For the first time in my adult life, my verbal machinery failed completely. Not because I was intimidated, because he wasn't asking for a defense. He was asking if I understood the weight of what I'd done. The honest answer was, I hadn't. Not until that moment. What I felt wasn't shame in the way I understood shame. The social discomfort of being caught in something you knew was wrong. It was older than that. It was the specific grief of a man who understands, too late, that he used something real. His platform, his intelligence, the trust readers placed in him, as a weapon against a frightened man who was telling the truth. He did not compound it. He said, "There is something you need to see." I was looking at people, not at individuals I recognized, not anyone from my life, not faces I could name. It was more like being given an elevation, a vantage point from which I could perceive humanity as a collective without losing any of its particularity. Each person distinct, each person present, and each person carrying something I had no prior category for. Some people appeared ordinary in every outward sense, and some people, and I want to be very careful with how I describe this, because every metaphor I reach for falls short. Some people carried something that I can only call a quality of completeness. Not a glow, though that word gets used in accounts like mine, because there's nothing better. Not a radiance. Something quieter than that. Something interior. As if something inside them was genuinely alive in a way that in other people was. Not dead, exactly. Sealed. Dormant. Like a room that has been closed for a long time without being destroyed. I understood, without being told, that what I was seeing had no correlation to anything external. Not wealth, not church attendance, not denominational affiliation, not ethnicity, not education, not any of the markers by which human beings sort each other into categories. What I was seeing was the condition of the heart. And then Jesus began to speak. The mark, he said, is not imposed. It is not assigned from outside or branded from above. It forms through choices, specifically through the accumulated weight of choices made in the space between pride and surrender. The space where a person encounters the moment of being wrong and decides what to do with it. The mark of the open heart. Those who chose forgiveness over grievance again and again. In the ordinary moments, where no one was watching and nothing was at stake except their own interior. Those who chose authentic connection over the performance of connection. Who let themselves be known rather than just seen. Those who chose humility over the need to be right when the cost of being wrong was real. The mark of the sealed heart. Not evil, not monsters. Ordinary people, people like me. People who chose, through years of small, quiet decisions, to protect themselves from the cost of being wrong. The cost of loving what might leave. The cost of believing what cannot be proven. The cost of admitting that something they dismissed might have been worth listening to. And I began to understand. The understanding arriving the way cold does, gradually and then completely, that my article was not a professional exercise. It was not criticism. It was not even really journalism. It was a choice, a specific, deliberate choice to seal myself against the possibility that a frightened man standing in bad lighting was telling the truth. I mocked his prophecy because believing it would have required me to reckon with things I had spent years avoiding. It was safer to make him a punchline. It was safer to be the cleverest person in the room. I looked at myself in the vision. I will not tell you what I saw. Not because it was monstrous, because it wasn't. It was ordinary. It was me. And that was, somehow, the most frightening thing of all, to see the shape of the choices I had made, rendered visible, and to recognize them as choices rather than character. I asked about 2026. I said it the way I imagine someone says anything to Jesus in that place. Not as a journalist pressing a source, not with the detachment I'd always brought to questions of faith. with the voice of a man who no longer had a professional register to retreat to. He did not give me a date-stamped event. He did not describe catastrophe or celestial spectacle. What he described was a threshold, a moment in the accumulation of human choice when the pattern becomes fixed in a way that makes the separation visible. Not imposed from without, but settled from within, like water finding its level, like a decision that has been approaching for years, finally arriving. Those who carry the mark of the open heart will enter what comes next with themselves intact, not rewarded from the outside. Themselves, fully, finally themselves, without the weight of all the protection they no longer need to carry. Those who carry the mark of the sealed heart will face the thing they spent their lives avoiding, the truth of themselves without armor, not punishment delivered from above, something harder, the settling of a reckoning they always knew was waiting. I asked if it could be changed. I meant myself. We both knew I meant myself. He answered, and the answer was not a formula, not a prayer, not a denomination, not a list of things to do or stop doing. He offered me a question. Are you willing to stop being right? I stayed with that for a moment that had no duration. Are you willing to stop being right? Not willing to be wrong. That's the easy concession, the one that costs nothing, because it's still about you. Willing to stop making rightness the currency of your interior life. Willing to let the truth arrive from sources you've decided not to respect. Willing to lay down the mechanism itself. Nothing in my life had been as hard as that question. I didn't want to go back. I know how that sounds. I'm not describing blissful peace so overwhelming that life seemed tragic by comparison. What I'm describing is starker. In that space, I had seen my own interior with the lights on. I understood the structure of what I'd built and what it had cost. Going back meant going back as that man, with that understanding sitting inside me, without any of the rationalizations I'd used to make it bearable. The alternative, staying, wasn't about reward. It was about the fact that the version of me that existed in that place was more honest than any version I'd managed in 38 years of living. Jesus told me the return was necessary, not as punishment, not as rejection. He was not sending me back because I had failed. He was sending me back because there was something I was supposed to carry, not an elaborate mission, not a new platform or a ministry or a movement, something small and urgent and entirely without performance. Tell what you saw. I became aware of my body before I wanted to. The first thing I felt was the return of weight, the specific gravity of a physical form, then sound, the acoustic texture of a hospital room, monitors, then pain, which was honest in the way pain always is. And then I saw Sarah's face. She was leaning forward in the chair beside my bed. Her eyes were closed. Her hands were folded. She had been praying. I watched her for a moment before she knew I was conscious. The woman who had read my article about Elias Rowe and said nothing, who had believed in something quietly without argument for the entire duration of our marriage, while I found sophisticated ways to explain why I didn't need to. She was the first thing I saw when I came back. I didn't have words for what had happened. I still don't. Not really. But after a long moment, with the monitors steady and my chest full of something I had no name for, I said the only thing that was true. I said, "I think I owe you an apology." She opened her eyes. She didn't know what I meant. She didn't need to. Not yet. I did. I'm not a pastor. I didn't join a church or build a new identity around what happened to me. What changed is quieter than any of that and, honestly, harder. I still think too often about being right. I catch myself constructing arguments in conversations that don't need them. The machinery didn't disappear. It became visible to me, which is its own kind of discipline. I think about Elias Rowe often. I reached out to him about 4 months after the hospital. A short message, nothing elaborate, just, "I was wrong about you." "And I'm sorry," he wrote back. He wasn't angry. He said he hoped I was well, that he was praying for me. That lack of anger bothered me more than anger would have, because anger would have felt symmetrical. His kindness left the debt in place and made it clear that the debt was never really between us. It was between me and what I had refused to let in. Here's what I was sent to say. The mark is not an event. It is not something that will happen to you in 2026. It is something that is happening to you now, in the choices you make, in the ordinary moments that feel too small to matter. The grievance you've been carrying for 2 years, because releasing it would mean admitting you were partly wrong. The love you won't fully enter, because loving completely means being fully seen. The warning that arrived from someone you decided wasn't worth listening to. The friend who pushed back too hard. The pastor on the bad-lit documentary. The quiet voice in your own interior that you keep reasoning away. Where, in your life, are you choosing to be sealed? Not in the dramatic moments. Not in the crises where the stakes are obvious and the choice feels real. In the texture of Tuesday. In the way you handle the conversation that gets uncomfortable. In whether you let yourself be wrong about something that matters, or whether you reach, automatically, elegantly, without even noticing, for the reframe. 2026 is not the beginning of the separation. That's the part I keep needing to say clearly, because I know the prophetic framing makes it sound like a starting gun. What Jesus showed me is that the separation is already happening. It has been happening for years, one small choice at a time, in the accumulated interior decisions of every person alive. 2026 is where the pattern becomes visible. The question is not whether you will be ready for that moment. The question, the one I heard from Jesus in that place, and hear again inside my own chest every morning since, is whether you are willing to start making different choices now. Are you willing to stop being right? There is still time to answer differently. The mark of the open heart is not a reward for a life lived perfectly. It is the condition of a heart that kept choosing, in the small moments when no one was watching, to stay open. I was a man who knew better. I told you that at the beginning, and I meant it as pride. I'm telling you again now, and I mean it as the most honest warning I know how to give. I was dead for 11 minutes, and the only thing I came back with, the only cargo I was given to carry into whatever comes next, was this: stay open.